Welcome to Lunch with Tech Leaders, where we have engaging conversations about software development and cloud engineering with industry leaders and subject matter experts. These episodes are created by the Great Lakes Tech Leaders, an online community of technology practitioners. Please come join the conversation by visiting gltl.rbn.ai. Again, that's gltl.rbn.ai. Now strap in, because we're deploying to production in 3, 2, 1.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of Lunch with Tech Leaders. My name is Adam Oberhausen. I'm the Director of Cloud Architecture with Right Brain Networks, and I'm your host for today. Joining me today is software and data consultant Tom Kowalski. Say hi, Tom.
Hello.
And Joe is absent today, so just you and I, Tom, on the hosting side, but we've got some of my colleagues from Right Brain to join us. If you want to give a round of introductions, allow people to say hello.
Yeah, looks like we got Ray back with us. Want to say hello?
Hey there.
Hey, Ray.
And
Todd, go ahead and introduce yourself as well.
Hey, Todd Meter. I'm an engineer at Right Brain.
Thanks for joining us, Todd. And Kevin?
Yep. Kevin Lucas, cloud architect at Right Brain.
Great. Phil, you wanna chime in, or are you just here to observe? I'll take that as just observing. So,
sorry, mostly observe. I haven't had a chance to use step functions myself, but I've heard a lot of good things about them.
Right on. So Tom, we had last week off. We're back to it this week. Are you excited to talk about step functions?
I am, yeah. I'd like to know more of the use cases. So, I've started using Lambda serverless, from the beginning, and there weren't step functions. So I kind of had patterns and practices, existing before step functions was introduced. And I haven't had a need yet to really use them. So yeah, I'm excited to hear about others use cases.
I'm in a similar boat. I've used lots of serverless stuff, but never tried out the step functions. So, let's start with the first question. And I'll shoot it over to you, Ray. What are step functions? Can you help us answer that question?
Yeah, certainly. They're a fully managed service provided by AWS. I really think of them as kind of a automation and orchestration tool that allows for you to coordinate steps between AWS services as well as other different workflows that you set up. They enable you to build scalable distributed applications and workflows, just like via JSON or using the visualization studio. I believe it's called the Workflow Studio inside of the AWS console itself. It's really an automation and orchestration tool overall.
Okay. Yeah, I did a little bit of research. I guess they've been around, like the step functions have been around since 2016. So they've been in the market for a while. So I think a lot of organizations are using them. And that's kind of like, when do you know, how do you know when you should be using a step function versus not?
That's a good question. I think in really any case, when you're trying to build some sort of automated workflow, you can consider step functions. They provide a ton of benefits that we'll probably get into a little bit here later. But really, when you want to provide a serverless workflow and orchestrate those steps, I would lean towards using step functions. I think Kevin could probably speak to this a little bit more as well, if you want. But essentially, it could be like a replacement for a Lambda. I know that we've talked a little bit back and forth about us as contractors providing a solution that maybe requires some sort of automation. And I used to lean towards just writing a Lambda. He kind of opened my eyes, stating that if you're providing a solution to another organization that maybe doesn't have a dedicated resource to manage that Lambda, there could be those could be deprecated in the future as you need to update your runtime and potentially, the application code itself.
And a few things I kind of want to comment on there. Step functions have been around for a while, but it was in the last 6 months to a year, I believe. I don't know what is time, that actually received a major update. Makes them a lot more useful. Like they were things that we had looked at in the past, but benefits they offered just wasn't really there for use until this most recent update. Ray's talking about managing Lambda, and that's very much something I feel passionately about. We work with a lot of different companies, clients. A lot of them don't have, a lot of them are kind of migrating out of a data center. They're trying to update, containerize, but maybe don't have resources really dedicated to managing Lambda. And for a long time, a lot of the functionality you would want, you still needed to write a Lambda for. There were only so many services that actually integrated with step functions.
When you say replacing a Lambda, can you do like general programming, right? Like a general programming language, or like how far can you go? Like what's the limit there?
So
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
All right. I was going to say, I mean, it's not a programming language per se. It's more of just a logic flowchart. So you can orchestrate interactions with AWS services, and it also provides some general like if else conditions, retry conditions. There are some like basic logic like that incorporated into it. But I mean, if you wanted to do something more verbose with it, you could write a Lambda that is executed as a step within your state function, your step function as well, and use the outputs from that.
Okay, so you wouldn't be able to do like maybe transforms, but you could do like logic flows of if this value is here, send it this way. If this value is like this, come in and send it that way.
It depends. There are limited. You have limited transform capabilities. Basically, you could think of it as Ray described. It's like a flow chart. You can form conditionals, loop back around previous actions that you've taken. And each action has an input and an output. And you can use JSON path as well as some intrinsic functions provided by step function when building the input or the output. So you can do things like building new objects or arrays, or like counting the number of objects in an array, or evaluating the truthiness of a condition, and adding that or using that to manipulate the output. Although you are still somewhat limited. There are some things that transforms, I don't want to say can't do, but a lot of times you got to be creative if you don't want to have to write custom code.
Right.
And looking at their features page, it says that the step functions integrate with 220 AWS services and over 10,000 APIs. So it looks like
that's the big expansion.
Yeah.
Back, up until probably about a year ago, it probably supported maybe 10 to 15 AWS services that it integrated with. And those pre-existing integrations were really well thought out. Like you could do things like you could have your state machine run a code build job. It would start the code build job and it would monitor it, and then you could get a report of like the result with all the artifacts and stuff when it was done. Then, say you wanted to make some other decisions and call some unsupported service based on the result, you'd have to write a Lambda for that, which and at that point defeats the purpose of just doing this in Lambda, because part of the reason I push for this is, again, it's more sustainable in the long term and more universal. But the big push that they had largely made it so you could use this with any kind of AWS service. The integrations aren't as fine-grained as like some of the original, more native ones, like the code build example I gave earlier. You can now pretty much call any AWS API you want, but to get the same functionality that was provided by, you could say, the managed integration, you have to call like start build, and you'd have to set up a loop that constantly calls for like get build status and check to see if it's done, and if not, then loop back around to check or put in a sleep and loop back around to check build status. And then once build status is success or failed, then you'd have more conditions that describe the output and output the same amount of things. So for the previously provided like managed integrations, kind of provided a whole like toolbox, or just run code
Let me ask
build
you this
job.
then, Kevin. If you're going to start with a new, how, can you answer the question of when you should use the step function versus when you should just use like a Lambda? Is it basically kind of like depending on the customer's how comfortable they are with? Is the benefit of the step function that you have like a visual editor that is easy to comprehend versus like looking at a code in a code in a Lambda? I'm still kind of confused, like why, what.
I would never say a visual editor is a reason to use technology.
Yeah.
I would say the benefit is more for sustainability. It's not about you don't want to look at code, but like I say, it's a flowchart, and you can see visual representations of that flowchart. So you can very easily narrow down, hey, this run failed, and it failed on this node, and these were the inputs, these were the outputs, and this was the error that that node generated. Which
Yeah.
can be a whole lot easier than like trying to figure out, let's say you wrote a Lambda function in Java. How many times is someone going to write that because they have a deadline to get, and your output is going to be a null reference exception? Okay, well, what does that mean in the context? Because Java, that could mean literally anything. Whereas here, you get exactly, this was the input. If as long as you're using like any of the not managed, but any of the AWS integrations provided, you'll see exactly what the error was that was returned, given input. So it helps troubleshooting. You can see exactly where something failed. And then, like I say, you never have to worry about, as long as you don't put Lambda functions in your step function, you never have to worry about, is this runtime going to be deprecated? Do I need to keep up to date? Am I going to need to patch, libraries and stuff that are in use? Installing third-party libraries in your Lambda. For a company that does a lot of stuff with Lambda anyway, that's not really an issue. Have just team members who manage their Lambda.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah. And just always go ahead, Tom.
Where I kind of find myself reaching for step functions is kind of a replacement for systems manager documents. If anybody's done a lot of work in those, you can do a lot of the same things and it's a lot simpler to put them together.
Yeah, system manager automations were something I pushed very heavily for a while for these same reasons, because you couldn't do a lot of this stuff with step functions. But then the update basically made them equivalent to systems manager documents, only they run a lot faster. They provide a much better output, like the visibility into what's going on, and they're a lot more customizable. Like step functions, you never loop. You can kind of iterate, but you can only do that by running stuff in parallel, and then hard to like rejoin everything that you split out.
So have you used these mostly more for like back-end automation, or have you also used it like in production, like customer-facing applications?
For our use case, a lot of it has been on the operations side. Of course, for me, that's because I am an operations guy more than anything. Especially when you get into things like express state machines. Those are very much things that can be just kind of like, oh, it gets called as part of a customer workflow.
Yeah.
That's where we've seen a lot of the benefits have been for things like custom deploys. You could almost say that we're using it, as a replacement for code pipeline. In that it can do a lot of, like I say, the branching logic and the ability to make decisions. Gives you a lot more flexibility. You can do things like, oh, I tried to update, I'm doing a deploy. This was the version I'm trying to deploy. So I'm going to roll that out to, first I'm going to run this code build job to migrate the database if like the customer doesn't have migrations built into the containers. And once that succeeds, I will update the ECS task, or I'll update the task definition, or I even just call like a code deploy job if you're that, to update task definition and get that
How's the
rolled out.
developer experience with that though? Like that's, it's like another tool. Like, do you integrate it with your your current CI/CD, or does that become your CI/CD?
What we tend to do in cases like this is, since it is just an AWS API call to start the execution, you'd basically have your CI system. It would do the build, it would push the image, and then the actual deployment would just be it calling this state machine with like the version it just built that you want to deploy.
Okay.
And I find it to actually be a lot more flexible than a lot of the built-in, deploy tools. One paradigm that we found works really well, again, as a consulting company that works with a lot of companies, is having basically, we use CDK, but a lot of times don't have clients who are just using CloudFormation or just using Terraform or anything like that. You can basically have a step function that just, at least for CloudFormation and CDK, those are both CloudFormation hood. There's some tricks you can use that with SSM parameters or your version in that, and then use step functions to do the update, and then you don't have to worry about, how do we integrate our infrastructure repo with like our app repo, because your infrastructure repo could have stuff that you want to make sure is well isolated from like things that the developers can call. So you can basically give the individual apps permission to call this step function to do a deploy. They don't have to do a whole new CDK build because all that changed is a version.
Okay.
That gets pulled in with like CloudFormation parameters.
Has anybody else used it for things outside of?
Yeah, I've got a different use case.
Yeah,
I had used step functions as basically to kind of hold state on like a process with an IoT device. So there would be I set up an API gateway that would trigger a step function that would basically call in, like it did a number of checks and like made a like kind of like a lock, like a locking, like a state lock to block block more processes from happening. Then it would kick off a Lambda. That Lambda was actually Swift code, because we were using the same module that was in the iOS application, but we were running it as like we called it like a cloud client. And it did some processing and stuff like that, but it needed to send a message back to the device. We did that through MQTT, so we would publish something and we would wait for a callback, and that we use the there's, what is that thing, where the step function can like pause and wait for external communication or like an external return. And then the device would pick that message up off of MQTT, do some other things, and then send a response. And basically, because that pause and wait for an external process couldn't be used with the, Kevin, you just mentioned them. They're like the fast process, or the turbo ones or something.
The Express step function.
Express. Yeah, because you can't use that with Express. It just wasn't super performant. It cost a lot. And so this process worked for us for a while. But once we started to scale, I ended up rewriting it and just having our MQTT broker called Lambda.
So with having something externally, like waiting for like a callback, does that service have to know like a specific, payload to send to?
Yeah,
the
it
step
has.
function, or can it
So
be generic?
when you say, "Hey, I'm going to go to an external process," step functions will give you a token, which is kind of like the state callback token. So how that worked is the first thing in my step function was to check and see if the payload had a task token, and if it did, then I would just restart I would send it. There was a Lambda that just kind of like kicked it back to the other step function.
Okay, so because I'm thinking like you could call Twilio and then wait for just like a generic Twilio webhook to come back to this step function, but you really couldn't do that because you'd have to have some layer that knows about the token, right? You can't just take
you'd
it
have to
generic.
have that task token and pass it back to the step function. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to get back to your state.
Okay.
That is one other big question being asked. When do you use this outside of things like Lambda functions? A lot of it comes down to when you have long-running workflows, where maybe there is a manual step that's required, or if what is the current Lambda timeout? Is it 15 minutes or an hour?
15 minutes.
Lambdas are great, but if it's like waiting on something to complete, you're being billed for that execution time while the Lambda waits. And if it goes more than 15 minutes, you're just kind of screwed, I guess you could say. Whereas a step function can, I think, if you're not using an Express step function, I think it can run for up to a month. Which a good example of that would be, again, working with clients. Sometimes, we have clients who want to manage their own DNS systems that we don't have access to, or need to do validation on SSL certificates. Like ACM, they need to someone needs to click an email or something. Another good case for that would be, you need to wait for the external interaction, but rather than needing to do the callback, you just kind of keep checking to see, is the certificate available? Is the DNS record verified?
So
can you go on for a few days.
Easily see these running ones because I've always used like SQS, right? If I have to wait for something, I fire off SQS with a delay on it, and then I come back and check after that delay or whatever. So is this just easier to see those? Can I see them in the console or something of things that are waiting?
Yeah, you can see in the console, it'll highlight what node you're on. You can see that it's kind of it would basically enter into a loop of, check the status. If it's not available, wait 15 minutes.
But can I see like instances running, right? Like, hey, this is, this step function is running and waiting, right? Can I see like a list of those?
You can, you can go into the step function, and then there's the execution IDs within there. If you click into the execution ID, you can get a visual representation of what's currently running, and you have useful colors like green, red, and blue, and yellow as well. So green meaning it's completed the step successfully. Red is generally the error in the specific step that failed. Blue is what's currently executing, and I believe yellow is past, like stuff that has been passed, and not applied. Perhaps it's gray. Don't quote me on that, but
yeah, no, it sounds a lot better than just like looking at SQS.
The other nice thing is that you can see all the transitions in the lower portion of that execution ID. So you can like get into each transition and see how the data has what your data is doing as it's running, essentially. And you can see the current inputs and outputs per step.
Yeah, which I guess kind of by comparison to like SQS. SQS, you're going to need something that picks up and reads from that queue to proceed. You're going to need to make sure that any information you're going to need downstream ends up on that queue when it's finished. Whereas with the step function, where it's just kind of like checking it is available, it still knows all of its previous state, and that state is bound to the specific execution it's running. So there's no ambiguity about like, what is the previous state of this event that ended up on the queue. Either got to discover it or like passing that state around the whole time of like events that happen downstream.
Okay. So when you're making these, are most of these kind of one-off, or are you doing these, infrastructure as code, part of an application? Are you making them in the console, or are you using the visual editor? What are you guys using?
I find the visual editor.
Everybody kind of chimed in at the same time.
Everybody at once, please.
We all really like the visual editor. It's really good for getting started with just kind of dragging and dropping things. Eventually, you probably have to descend into writing code, but it's a great tool for getting started.
Does it make it easy to convert? Right, like start with the editor, convert to.
Yeah,
I know those things are always bad that do that.
You can just convert it to you can switch back and forth right to the JSON, I think.
Yeah, it'll show you in the console. It'll show you the JSON for what you've designed in the visual editor.
Okay.
Just copy and paste that into your infrastructure as code, and you're basically done. So I think we're all of us here who have used it pretty much follow the same workflow, which is build it using the visual editor, and then take the result of that and put it into infrastructure as code.
Some other use cases, Tom, I think that are out there is using step functions for like a data pipeline or data processing, right? You can use a step function to automate data processing workflows, such as your ETL pipelines and things like that. Derek mentioned IoT. That seems like a really big one, but really strong use case for step functions, IoT devices. Kind of goes hand in hand with data processing, but machine learning workflows. So like in terms of model training and development, deployment, you can leverage these step functions. Just a couple things I researched for the show, and then obvious things like batch processing. There's so many different things you can use for batch processing in AWS, but step functions are another thing that could help with batch processing. And Kevin, I think, mentioned about how these can run for up to a month, whereas something like a Lambda, you have limitations with other services, but the step functions kind of give you that flexibility for really, really long running things.
Yeah, it seems like if there was like the built-in, like being able to use general programming language like Cloud Functions, right? Or now you can do it in AppSync. You can use JavaScript. Like if you could do that in the step functions, like almost completely eliminate the need for Lambda.
Keep in mind, you can, as I think Ray mentioned earlier, calling a Lambda can be a step. You can call a Lambda, give it any arbitrary input you want, and the Lambda's output will be the output of your step.
But
So-
like you said, right, and all the things that go along with the Lambda. If I could just, just write pure code, don't need access to disk or even networking, right? Just to do some transforms, some heavier logic, that would eliminate, 99% of my Lambda functions.
Yep. I think the real thing is that these things can be used for any complex process that might require things running at different times across multiple services. So maybe you need a code build job, and then you need to do a CloudFormation deploy, and then run a Lambda to, do some custom logic or make a call out to a third party to update them. And the nice thing is that, you have a lot of these. We're talking about SQS, how there's probably some service running that's calling something, and then that puts an event on the queue, which triggers another Lambda. It's almost exactly like that, except rather than needing to like link up, hey, I have this process, and over the course of this process, there are 3 different Lambdas that called. Maybe it's custom logic, and you still need to have 3 different Lambdas called at 3 different times, but using step functions and it links those together. You don't need to try and figure out, okay, you don't need to trace this was the Lambda execution that was related to this event, and that later invoked this other Lambda function, and now I got to link up those 2, and that downstream called another Lambda function. You can see all 3 of those Lambda executions. They're all part of the same flow chart. You can get a direct link to that execution. You see the results of each of them. You don't got to try to link them up yourself. They're already linked up for you.
Yeah, it's always a pain, like, to get the tracing to work throughout everything. But yeah, it sounds nice.
We're getting close to time, guys. I did want to touch on a few other things, which is some other tools out there outside of AWS. I don't expect you guys to be familiar with these, but I want to just mention them in case people are listening and want to know what's outside of AWS. There's a tool called Apache Airflow, open source workflow tool that allows developers to create and manage complex workflows. You guys ever hear of that or work with that?
Heard of it, but haven't used it myself. My understanding is that it's for like data pipeline and ETL workflows.
Yeah, I don't know either. You got on the Azure side, you got the Azure Logic apps, which it sounds like it's similar to Step Functions. Allows you to automate complex workflows and coordinate interactions between different services and APIs. But it sounds like the Azure is more geared towards like business process automation. Whereas the Step Functions in AWS are more focused on like data processing and distributed applications.
I wouldn't necessarily, I guess you could say, label either one that way. The beauty of them is just that they really are that flexible. There's so many use cases.
And then on the GCP, Google Cloud side, we got Google Cloud Workflows. Haven't looked at that. Seems like they're all like all the major cloud providers kind of seems like they have their own flavor of this workflow automation. So wanted to mention those. And then what else? I did want to ask you guys, like, so how do you do test automation with your step functions? Or is it like, I could imagine like the scenario where you kind of have this, you've built out this somewhat complex step function, state machine. How do you test all the different scenarios? How do you is there automated testing techniques to ensure like you're covering all the paths as you develop these complex state machines?
I usually do end-to-end testing. I would love to get to the point to like do integration testing as well as unit testing potentially for this, but usually just performing good end-to-end tests is what I've been doing. So providing real world kind of like sample data as my inputs and testing all possible states within my workflow. That's usually my process.
Yeah, I don't know how you would be able to, like, since there isn't any actual code generally of its own that's part of the workflow. It's just like a JSON flowchart. Almost any node depends on the outputs of the previous node, so you can't really just test one node in a vacuum. Especially since usually you're just like making API calls or stuff to third-party services. It's really just are your outputs and your inputs, right?
Yeah. Just wanted to see if you guys had thoughts around that. So that's interesting to hear. In terms of resources for listeners who want to learn more about step functions, you've got there's a great getting started tutorial with AWS that AWS provides. There's the AWS Step Functions workshop, which is a series of labs and exercises that guide you through the process of building and deploying the step functions. And there's also a good repository on GitHub called the AWS Step Functions Examples, which is kind of a collection of sample workflows that demonstrate all the use cases and scenarios for AWS Step Functions. So yeah, on that, I want to thank everyone for joining the show today. Kevin, Ray, great insights. Todd, Derek, you as well. And of course, Tom.
Thank you,
Thank everyone
Adam.
for listening. You're welcome. Hope you found the conversation informative and valuable. We'd love to have everyone come back and join us next episode, where Ray is going to host a conversation about GitHub Copilot.
Nice.
Looking forward to that. So take care, everyone. Lunch is over, so get back to work.
All right.